Good day. Today is Wednesday, 2nd July 2025, and before I start on my main topics on this video, which will, by the way, mostly centre on the developments in Ukraine, though I do intend to touch on latest developments in the Middle East. But before I start on those big topics, I would like to say something about the political situation in Britain. Now, anybody in Britain who has been following the news over the last couple of days, though I doubt that this is true of anybody else outside Britain. Why would people outside Britain follow the news in Britain closely? But anybody in Britain who's been following the news at all closely knows, or should know, that the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, is now, as far as I can see, basically holed under the waterline. His flagship welfare reform bill, which is supposed to pass the House of Commons, has just done so, but not without 49 Labour MPs voting against it. And the fact that 49 Labour MPs voted against it is remarkable in itself, and made still more remarkable by the fact that in the week running up to the passing of the bill, Starmer and his officials made one concession after another to dissident voices within the parliamentary Labour Party, whereby, by the time the bill passed, none of the fundamental reforms, or if you prefer, more accurately, cuts in benefit payments that the bill started with, were still in the bill by the time it was actually voted through. So we have seen Starmer not only face a massive rebellion within his parliamentary party, but in effect he capitulated to that parliamentary rebellion by his party. And even then, after that total and complete capitulation, he still found that 49 of his MPs were voting against him. The only reason the bill passed, in fact, the obvious reason why it passed, is of course because the Labour Party, as a result of what happened in the election last year, has an overwhelming majority in the House of Commons, 170 plus majority in the House of Commons. Now, there are many things to say about this event. I expect that Alex Christoforou and I will be doing a programme looking at British politics in detail, in which I will explain my own personal take on these events, one which points to a deeper crisis within Britain, which in my opinion extends back to the 1960s. But I'm not going to devote my time on this programme to discussing that here. What I will say instead is that, in my opinion, after this vote, it's absolutely clear that Keir Starmer is no longer in political control. He has no longer got control over his own party. His MPs in the House of Commons no longer trust him and have made it abundantly clear that they no longer like him. His ministers in his government distrust and dislike him too, and many of them are now calculating how they can organise themselves in a better way in order to replace him. And, well, to use that famous phrase that is often used in British politics, Starmer is in office, but he is no longer in power. So, there it is. A Prime Minister elected with a massive majority last year, but now mortally wounded. I don't expect that he will continue to be Prime Minister for much longer. The only reason why he might be able to drag out things for a few more months, perhaps a year at most, though I personally would be surprised if it took a year, is because there is no very clear and obvious successor within the Labour Party to take over from him. They're all almost as unconvincing and implausible as prime ministers of Britain to take over from Starmer, as Starmer is himself. All the names I've heard, West Streeting, Angela Rayner, all of the rest, none of them, in my opinion, are remotely the sort of people that you would be looking to take over and take charge of Britain and finally start to addressing the deep-seated problems that beset British society. Anyway, it is only the lack of convincing alternatives that keeps Starmer there, and which might keep him there for a while out of sheer inertia. But sooner or later, he will be gone. In the meantime, I want to make one very simple and very obvious point, one which I made before in many programs. Britain, we are told, is in the middle of a major budgetary and fiscal crisis. That is true. Some say that the fault for that is an exploding welfare benefits bill. I think that there is a limited amount of truth in that, but I don't think it comes anywhere close to being the whole truth. I would make one point, however, that this welfare bill, if it had been passed in its original form, would have shaved £5 billion off Britain's benefit bill. That exactly corresponds to the £5 billion that Britain continues to give to Ukraine in direct grants every year. It does not also look at the enormous costs British society has incurred as a result of the economic war that the West has been waging against Russia. Suffice to say that energy prices in Britain are, I believe, the highest in Europe and perhaps the highest in the collective West. People in Germany might find that surprising, but I believe that that is true. So this question, this issue, this matter never gets talked about in Britain. There is never any discussion of it. Nobody discusses whether aid to Ukraine is affordable at this time, given all of the enormous fiscal pressures which exist in Britain today. And the fact that we are not having debates about these issues, even debates made in which people who might want to push back on that point might seek to refute it, would have an opportunity to make their points and to make their arguments. The fact that we're not having any debate on that subject explains, in my opinion, why we are in this much deeper and wider crisis, which goes far beyond the inadequacies of one man, Keir Starmer, profoundly inadequate in this situation, though he unquestionably is. Anyway, Starmer will be gone. There is no, I believe, before very long, there is no reason to think that his successor, whoever he is, will be much different or any better. This Labour government will probably drag on its life for a further 4 years. Again, I can't imagine that it will call a general election anytime soon. And the Conservative Party looks to me as exhausted and as discredited and as barren of ideas and as unwilling to address the realities, the underlying realities, as the Labour Party is. There remains the issue of reform, but reform so far and Nigel Farage have not put together anything that remotely can be described as a convincing programme. So that's what I'm going to say. we perhaps ought to prepare ourselves before long for the departure of Keir Starmer. But in my opinion, the crisis in Britain is much more profound than that. And perhaps looking forward, it might be a time before long when Britain will no longer carry the weight in world affairs that it used to do, and which some people imagine that it still does. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about the situation in Britain now. Now, the big news, in my opinion, over the last 24 hours is a series of media reports that have appeared in the United States, first in Politico and then in the New York Times, which confirm that the United States is suspending deliveries of weapons, further weapons, to Ukraine. And it is important to say that this is not deliveries that had been authorized by the current president, Donald Trump. They are deliveries that were authorized by the previous president, Joe Biden, exercising his drawdown authority, and on the strength of the appropriation, the $61 billion appropriation made by the US Congress in April 2024. So what we're talking about is weapons which Biden authorized and which were to be supplied to Ukraine, and which Ukraine can perhaps legitimately say that it was promised. And these weapons apparently include some of the key weapons that Ukraine has been relying upon in order to fight the Russians. So apparently Ukraine is not going to receive any more Patriot missile interceptors over the next few months. It is not going to receive any more HIMARS rockets. It is not going to receive any more air-to-air missiles launched by F-16s to shoot down Russian drones. Not that those missiles have proved especially effective, it must be said. And apparently there is going to be a stop on further deliveries of 155mm shells. Now, it is important to say that this is a suspension, not a cancellation of the commitment to supply these weapons. In other words, we're looking at a pause, not an indefinite stop. But some of us might wonder whether a decision will ever be made in the United States to resume these weapons deliveries in the future, given the underlying procurement crisis that the United States is facing. Now, here, perhaps, I should say that this information, to anybody who has been following the discussions that we've had on the Duran, Alex Christoforou and I, and who's been watching this program, but perhaps especially anybody who has been following the many updates and discussions about US arms deliveries to Ukraine that Brian Boletic, month after month, has been providing on the new Atlas. Anybody who's been following all of those various programs would not be surprised that we have finally come to this point, because there has always been an inability by the United States and by its European allies to meet Ukraine's demands. Ever since the United States started to supply heavy weapons to Ukraine in quantity in the early summer of 2022, it has been clear that Ukraine has been burning through American weapon supplies and indeed Western weapons supplies at a faster rate than the industrial system in the West, not just in the United States, but in Europe also, could replace these weapons. And given that the United States has global interests and responsibilities, it has just been through a military crisis with Iran in the Middle East. It is feverishly planning a war against the world's industrial colossus, which is China, in the Pacific. Given that the United States has all of these competing demands upon its military and its military industrial resource base, it was inevitable eventually that this decision that has now been made would be made. Supposedly, according to the American media, the person who is behind this decision is the Assistant Secretary of Defense, Elbridge Colby, a person who's always been a skeptic about arms deliveries to Ukraine, a person who believes that the primary focus of the United States should be China, and that the United States should husband its resources, and that Ukraine has been a massive distraction and a diversion of those resources, and who has consistently and single-mindedly insisted that the focus should be on China and that the United States needed every weapon it had to hold back China in the Pacific. Well, I've no doubt that Mr. Colby did play a significant part in making this decision. Maybe he played the main part. But ultimately, this decision, sooner or later, would have had to be made. The Biden administration, Sullivan and Blinken and people like that were in denial about these realities. So were many people in the US Congress. So were even more people in Europe. But sooner or later, the reality was that the United States would have to cut back on weapons deliveries to Ukraine because it didn't have the means to sustain them indefinitely. I remember that as far back as the summer of 2023, right in the middle of Ukraine's summer offensive, the United States had to stop deliveries of unitary 155mm shells to Ukraine because of problems with the American stockpile of shells, and had to send shells with cluster munitions instead. There were confident predictions that the United States would be able to crank up production of shells eventually, but as we will now see, even that didn't fully turn out to be true, and the United States is still struggling to supply Ukraine with all the shells it needs, as are, by the way, the European states. And this is what has brought about the crisis that Ukraine is facing now. And it is important to say that there is no reason to think that Europe is going to be able to fill the gap. Now, there's much discussion about this, about the United States transferring the burden of the war from itself to its European allies. And certainly that is the rhetoric in the United States, and it is the rhetoric on the part of some people in Europe also. But if you actually go through and look at production realities in Europe, you will quickly notice that there has been hardly any increase in overall military output at all over the last 3 years, despite all the overblown rhetoric about massive fiscal spend, creating up of new funds, $800 billion plans or euro plans to increase military production in Europe. All of those things the transfer of car factories to weapons production, any of those things. I believe that in Germany, shell production, artillery shell production, has increased. I have not been able to find consistent figures for this, and I'm not absolutely sure even that is the case. In the United States, artillery shell production, by contrast, has indeed increased. So at the start of the special military operation in the spring of 2022, I remember that US artillery production of 155 millimeter shells stood at 14,000 shells a month. Then it increased, it doubled after a huge amount of effort and work to 28,000 shells, 155 millimeter shells a month, and this is hailed as a great achievement. Then we learnt, there were reports that production of shells would increase further and was increasing further, and new factories, a second factory to produce shells was coming online, and there were reports that shell production had increased to 36,155 millimeter shells a month. And then at the end of last year, the Biden administration claimed that production had finally grown to 50,000 shells a month, and that an overall target to increase shell production to 100,000 shells a month, 1.2 million shells a year, that plan was on track. Now, as various people, Brian Beletic pointed out, even if the United States achieved production of 1.2 million shells a year, that would still mean it was producing perhaps a third of the number of shells that Russia was producing, except that I believe that actual shell production in Russia is significantly higher than the 3 to 4 million shells a year that some people are saying. Anyway, it would still have been, as I said, significantly, in fact, very short of what the Russians are already achieving. Except it looks as if some of those claims about increased American shell production might have been wrong. Now, there's a good piece about this by Simplicius the Thinker on Substack, but suffice to say that it now seems that the new administration has just done an audit, and they've discovered that production, in fact, has fallen back to 40,000 shells a month. It might, in fact, never have been more than that. And it could be that instead of rising because of production bottlenecks, it might actually, again, start to decline. Now, I'm not going to speculate about that in this program. Simplicius the Thinker points out correctly that the much talked about second factory to build the shells that was being set up in the United States was essentially a factory that was being imported wholesale right down to the machine tools and the workers from Turkey, and which was to be set up in the United States. I have come across that kind of process. It's not, by the way, unique. You do sometimes find situations where entire factories are basically built in countries using all the machine tools and plants and many of the workers drawn from other countries. As I said, it's not unique, but it is a complex undertaking, and it can take time. And, well, also dealing with a country like Turkey, and I'm going to be careful what I say now, I think one should be extremely careful to count the dollars before entering into arrangements like that. And that kind of arrangement anyway, with a Turkish partner, needs careful management and very, very close supervision and accounting. It doesn't seem as if any of that was done, and there are apparently massive programs with the new factory. Now, maybe in time, all of this is going to be resolved, but from what Simplicius the thinker was saying, my own guess is that it would take perhaps 2 years to get this factory into some kind of operational shape. Maybe a year if one is lucky, though I have to say I have some doubts about that. 2 years perhaps. 5 years would be a realistic timetable in order to expect an entirely new factory to be hitting its production targets, its full production targets. These things take time, and trying to cut corners can often create problems. Simplicius the thinker also suggests, incidentally, that some of the increases in production that were being reported last year was basically the result of refurbishing old shells rather than building entirely new ones. Now, as I said, that's the United States. I'm not so familiar with the situation in Europe. My own sense is that production of shells in Europe is not progressing very far. I accept that there might be increases in shell production in places like Germany and the Czech Republic, but I would like to see more reliable figures than the figures I have actually seen up to now. And a number of commentators have already been pointing out that the 12-day war between Iran and Israel resulted in the United States burning through 20% of its stockpile of THAAD missiles. Some say 15%. But anyway, one gets a sense of how fast inventories in the West run down. Brian Beletic gave estimates of the true production rate of Patriot missile interceptors by Raytheon in the United States. I noticed last year that the United States, that Raytheon was claiming that it was exceeding those figures. Latest estimates seem to suggest, at least to me, that Brian Beletic was actually more accurate about Patriot missile production than Raytheon was. Just saying, I might be wrong about that. But anyway, the point is that on best estimates, the United States is producing around 600 Patriot air defense missile interceptors a year. And as Larry Johnson recently pointed out on his indispensable Sonar 2021 blog, that is nowhere near enough to match Ukraine's needs, let alone the US's own needs and those of the US's other allies, given that apparently 2 missile interceptors have to be launched for there to be any realistic hope of shooting down an incoming ballistic or other type of missile. So there simply aren't enough, there isn't enough equipment to go round. The United States and the West in particular are coming up and came up some time ago against fundamental capacity, military industrial capacity constraints that whatever their objectives, whatever grandiose plans they might have had, they simply cannot overcome. Even if production increases to a certain extent, even if the United States resumes deliveries of weapons to Ukraine in 1, 2, 3, 6 months' time, a year's time, assuming there's any Ukraine left in a year's time, it will still almost certainly run into the same problem, that it is burning through its weapons faster. Ukraine is burning through its weapons faster than the United States and the West collectively can replace them. Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, recently said that Russia produces more weapons in 3 months than the entire collective West does in a year. I am going to suggest that Mark Rutte is exaggerating. He is exaggerating the number of weapons that the collective West is actually producing. I think the gap between Russian weapons production and that of the collective West is even greater than what he is saying. And I have discussed again in many programs how the idea that simply throwing money at a problem, offering more and more money to contractors to get them to provide more weapons, is a completely mistaken industrial approach, that all that does, if the underlying production and supply side problems are not addressed, is inflate the price of weapons rather than produce more of them, which is great for the profits of the military contractors, but does not actually help Ukraine on the battlefield. And again, there's more and more evidence that this is proving to be true. So Ukraine apparently is now struggling to produce the number of drones it needs on its battlefronts. Ukrainian commanders have been complaining about this. It's probably connected, I am guessing it's connected, mostly with the stop of Chinese drones. The Chinese government recently took steps to restrict exports of the cheap drones that it makes. The result is that the Ukrainians are having to depend on Western drone suppliers and component parts from the West to build their drones, and they are finding that the cost of their drones is inflating at a rate which makes their drones uncompetitive against the far cheaper Russian ones. So this is the problem. And if I can also make a further observation, one of the greatest, most absurd claims that is being floated around recently is that industrialization in the West can take place on the back of further military production. Supposedly, if you increase military production, if you convert car factories into tank or armoured vehicle factories, this will somehow solve your economic problems. It will do no such thing. It will, on the contrary, massively aggravate your economic problems. And you cannot produce weapons in quantity in that sort of way. If we look at the situation today in Germany and in Britain, I read a report about the situation in Britain just a few days ago, discussing the state of the industrial economy, the manufacturing economy, or what is left of it in Britain. Britain is still deindustrializing. Indeed, in the first year of Starmer's government, deindustrialization in Britain has markedly accelerated, just as it is doing in Germany. The lesson that was provided by the two world wars, by the conflicts that have been fought since the end of the world wars, and by the conflict in Ukraine is that if you are going to have an effective, successful military industrial strategy, it must be anchored in a much larger civilian manufacturing industrial base. It is that which is missing in the West as a result of the various deindustrialization processes which have begun, which have been underway for some time. In the United States, because the United States has retained more of its industrial base than some European countries have done, it is still able to produce weapons in significant quantities. The idea that Britain can increase military production, given the decline in its overall industrial base, the idea that Germany can increase military production, given the precipitate decline of its industrial base, is a fantasy. It is absurd. It again shows that there is a basic lack of understanding of manufacturing and industrial realities. Where, for example, are the skilled workers going to come from if there are no civilian factories where they obtain training? Just to say. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say. We are now, as I said, at that point finally, which has been reached, that the United States, at least for the time being, is pausing deliveries of weapons to Ukraine. And, well, it could be that this pause will become an indefinite stop. I think it is likely. I think this is a completely, qualitatively different decision than the one that was made in March, when the United States briefly suspended military weapons deliveries in order to put pressure on Ukraine. That was in order to get the Ukrainians to agree to the American demand for a ceasefire. I think this time, because it is clearly driven by capacity issues, there's at least a possibility that this decision will never be reversed. Now, what does this mean for Ukraine on the battlefronts? Well, I think that Ukraine is already desperately short of personnel on the battlefronts. Its ability to keep up with the Russians in drone warfare is now eroding. Ukraine has relied heavily on weapons supplies from the West, shells, ammunition, armoured vehicles, all of those things. Without weapons, armies cannot fight, and it's difficult to see how it can happen that this will not have a big effect on Ukraine's ability to sustain the war going forward. The Ukrainians in particular have been complaining vociferously recently about the crisis they're facing in the sky. The fact that the Russians are able to launch 500 Geran drones against Ukraine night after night. There are reports that the factory in Kazan, which is producing these Geran drones, is now increasing output and might actually before long achieve a production rate of around 1,000 Geran drones a day. Ukraine has been insistently asking for more air defense interceptors, for more Patriot missile interceptors, for more air-to-air missiles for its F-16 fighters to shoot down these drones. We've already seen how the F-16s that were deployed in Ukraine and have been trying to shoot down the drones are getting swamped by the sheer number of drones. We've already seen also how the Russians are able to strike at targets across Ukraine, and air defenses are barely functioning anymore. We've seen how Ukraine's best defended city, which was Kiev, is also becoming increasingly vulnerable and open to Russian missile and drone attacks. And I can't help but think that with the aid stop, that problem is going to aggravate massively. But of course, it goes beyond this, because it's not just drones and missiles with which Russia is pummeling Ukraine. The Russian Air Force continues to get more powerful. The Russians continue to receive deliveries of Sukhoi 34 and 35 and fifth generation 57 fighter jets. They are producing, it is claimed, roughly 75,000 guided fab bombs a year. Production is said to be growing. Reports that I discussed some months ago, based on a piece by a Russian blogger, fighter bomber, that Ukrainian jamming was making the fab bombs ineffective. Well, those reports have proved to be untrue. The fab bombs are still hitting their targets and are still doing massive damage. And of course, as the Ukrainian air defenses wither away and disappear, the Russian aircraft, the Sukhoi 34s especially, can roam over more and greater areas of Ukrainian airspace, can start dropping bombs on Ukrainian positions further behind the front lines. They can do more damage, they can destroy more fortified positions that the Ukrainians have. They can perhaps even start bombing Ukrainian troops on the front line, something that the Russians have not done much of up to now. Anyway, the balance of advantage in the air is going to shift further towards the Russians, inevitably so. And many people have been commenting upon the fact that the Russians, in their various advances, have become sparing in their use of armoured vehicles. This is undoubtedly reflecting some of the characteristics of the ground war at the present time. But production rates and information that we are getting show that there is no actual shortage of armoured vehicles in Russia. And in fact, the reserve armies are being piled up with more tanks and armoured vehicles, presumably in preparation for the breakthrough that these reserve armies are intended to exploit. The reality is that more dramatically, it is the Ukrainians now who are short of armoured vehicles. One sees increasingly few tanks in the Ukrainian army anymore. And there was an article recently in the German media which said that Ukraine has just 120 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles left to basically cover the entire front. So all of this is inevitably going to have an effect, a cumulative effect over time. The Ukrainian government has withdrawn from the Convention on use of landmines, a convention which I remember the late Princess Diana in Britain actively campaigned for. That convention, it seems to me, is dying. But anyway, that's another story. One can understand why, because presumably Ukraine can still make mines, which are relatively simple things to make and probably do not require huge quantities of raw materials. It seems to me that Ukraine which has never really used minefields with the kind of intelligence and success that the Russians have done, probably before long will be claiming that it is the mines that are going to hold back the Russians, even as the famous drone wall that we have been hearing so much about falters. And recently, the Russians began missile strikes against Ukrainian cement and concrete factories that produce cement and concrete, clearly intended to make it more difficult for the Ukrainians to build fortifications. This makes complete sense because the Russians are close to breaking through the last major Ukrainian fortified lines. So again, one could see the accumulated problems, and this American decision is going to make those problems worse. Now, I suspect that Western governments, European governments, have been aware of this American decision, that this American decision was coming for some time. I am going to make a guess that European governments were quietly informed about it by the United States, probably before the NATO summit meeting, the recent NATO summit meeting, which took place in The Hague. That may explain some of the muted language that came out of that NATO summit meeting. Why there was no real push to get the United States to recommit to Ukraine, to get Donald Trump to recommit to Ukraine. Why all of the rhetoric about sending peacekeeping forces to Ukraine had fallen by the wayside. Why the European governments were so ready to sign up to a statement, a NATO statement, that heavily toned down earlier criticism from NATO of Russia and of support for Ukraine. The Europeans would have known that the Americans were pulling back in critical ways, and the Europeans would have known that they are in no position to fill the gap that the Americans are now leaving behind. So, probably some of the very strange commentaries that I have been reading in the British media over the last couple of days, like that very strange article by Owen Matthews in the Daily Telegraph, which I discussed at some length in my programme yesterday, they now begin to make sense. The anger, the frustration, the bafflement that the Russians are able to keep advancing despite all of the enormous losses that they are supposed to be experiencing. Perhaps, in fact, most probably, the Europeans, the Americans too, believe in these enormous losses that the Russians are supposed to be experiencing. The information for it, as I said in my program yesterday, almost certainly ultimately comes from Ukraine, but you want to believe it. Now you are becoming angry because despite all of those losses, the Russians grind on, and you know that there is no possibility that you can stop them. Without the Americans, stopping the Russians is impossible. The Americans know it. The Europeans know it. Probably deep down, the Ukrainians know it too. It explains also the urgent need of all of these countries, the Americans, the Europeans, the Ukrainians now, the urgent need and calls to the Russians for ceasefires. Why, according to Gideon Rachman in the Financial Times, whenever Western officials now turn up in Kiev, they find that the Ukrainians, who just 6 months ago were refusing even to contemplate ceasefires now are urgently seeking them, are trying to get the Russians to agree to ceasefires, because they know that they are, with the Americans departing, at coming to the end of the road. And perhaps, and not coincidentally, we have now finally seen maybe the first serious move by a European leader to resume some kind of dialogue with the Russians. That European leader is none other, of course, than Emmanuel Macron. Now, Macron, I should say recently, basically appointed himself the European Union and NATO's, the European Union's chief negotiator with the Russians. The Spanish Prime Minister, Mr. Sanchez, in a meeting a few months ago, suggested that the Europeans did need to appoint somebody to conduct diplomacy on behalf of Europe with the Russians. That entirely obvious suggestion provoked a furious response from the EU's High Representative for Foreign Policy, Kaja Kallas. She insisted that if anybody would negotiate with the Russians, it ought to be her. The Europeans had enough connection to reality to realise what an absurd idea that was, and they agreed that somebody else should be appointed to take her place. And Emmanuel Macron then promptly proposed himself, as he always does. He then did absolutely nothing. He sat on his hands. He too, I noticed, has been speaking less recently about sending military forces to Ukraine or peacekeeping forces to Ukraine. Yesterday, finally, after a protracted delay, he called and spoke to Vladimir Putin. Now, here I'm going to say a few things. Macron perhaps is unaware of the fact that Putin cannot stand him. This is fairly well known, I believe, in Russia. The Russians had many encounters with Macron in the days leading up to the special military operation. There's a long history of contacts between Macron and Putin, going back all the time to Macron's election. Putin was apparently furious when, over the course of a trip to France, shortly after Macron was elected, Macron started to lecture Putin on Russia's history and Peter the Great and Russia's European destiny. Putin apparently felt that Macron massively wasted his time over the course of long discussions immediately prior to the start of the special military operation, over the course of which Macron, in extraordinary, intelligent, elegant French, promised much and delivered nothing. I remember that over the course of a Security Council meeting, it emerged that Macron, on one occasion, kept Putin up late into the night, to no point and to no purpose. There was also an astonishing telephone call between Putin and Macron, in which Putin found to his astonishment that Macron had had the entire French media sitting in quietly, listening into the whole discussion without informing Putin in advance. Straightforwardly, Putin doesn't like Macron and doesn't trust him. So Macron may not understand that. He may not realize that he has very little credit in Moscow, that the Russians also remember how in 2021 it was Macron who apparently told the Russians, to Putin himself, to Putin's absolute fury, that the time had come for the Russians to ditch the Minsk agreement. Just saying. But anyway, Macron doesn't apparently get any of that. He still believes that he is a genius of diplomacy, and he has decided to call Putin. And apparently and predictably, he kept Putin on the phone for 2 hours. A longer, more protracted conversation than any of the conversations Putin has had with Donald Trump, the President of the United States. And Macron perhaps thought that the moment to do this had come, because clearly he's very embarrassed and feels very awkward to discuss the situation in Ukraine, which has to be the main topic of discussion between any Russian and European leader. But Macron was careful to take a line over the recent conflict between Israel and Iran, which probably he knew would be close to the one that the Russians were taking. I remember being surprised how over the course of the 12-day war, Macron was making statements about how regime change in Iran was completely wrong, how it was necessary for the Americans and the Israelis to keep the doors open to Iran, how negotiations with Iran were ultimately the only way forward. Not really very characteristic rhetoric from Macron, at least not in recent years. He has been as hostile to Iran as any other Western leader has been until very recently. So this is a change in tone from Macron. I now think that he adopted that tone because knowing what he knew, that the Russians were pulling out, that the Americans were cutting back on arms deliveries to Ukraine, he wanted a talking point with Putin, where he felt that he would be able to agree to achieve common ground with Putin, and then that would lead to a productive, from Macron's point of view, conversation about Ukraine. I accept the last is all speculation on my part, but I have been watching Macron very closely ever since he became president, and I suspect, knowing what a complicated man he is and having a sense of how he thinks, I am fairly confident that about this I am right. Anyway, he did call Putin, and the Russians have provided us with a readout, which I will now read. It's not very long, doesn't reflect the fact that this was a 2-hour call. But anyway, which suggests that a lot of it, as one would expect from Macron, was hot air. But anyway, this is what the Russian readout says. The two leaders had a detailed conversation on the state of events in the Middle East in light of the conflict between Iran and Israel, as well as the US strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. Vladimir Putin and Emmanuel Macron emphasized that Russia and France, as permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, bore particular responsibility for upholding peace and security in the Middle East or elsewhere, as well as for preserving the global non-proliferation regime. By the way, that sentence, the sentence I have just read, almost exactly mirrors language typically used in discussions that the Chinese have in Chinese readouts. When the Chinese talk to the Americans, when they talk to the Russians, when they talk to other great powers, the British and the French, I don't know whether they are great powers, but anyway, permanent Security Council members, the Chinese are always careful to speak about how permanent members of the Security Council have a particular responsibility for upholding peace and security. It looks as if the Russians in their readouts, have chosen to adopt the same language. Anyway, there we go. And the readout then continues. In this regard, it was noted that respecting Tehran's legitimate rights to develop peaceful nuclear technology and continue fulfilling its obligations under the Treaty on the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, which includes cooperating with the IAEA, was crucial. Now notice that the Russians agree with the French that Iran should continue to cooperate with the IAEA. That's part of the provisions of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The Iranians have completely pulled out of that. Pezeshkian has now confirmed to the IAEA that it is not welcome any longer in Iran. I've said in many programs that the Russians do not want Iran to develop a nuclear weapon, that they want an agreement whereby Iran will commit not to developing a nuclear weapon and to stick by the nuclear non-proliferation regime. And we see that, as the Russians obviously know, includes future cooperation with the IAEA. So to come back to the various discussions that I've had in recent programs on this channel, if the Iranians do agree to Russian offers of assistance with air defense, creating air defense, integrated air defense systems, then they will have to agree to let the IAEA back in. And the Chinese, I can say in advance, will make that demand of Iran also. I have discussed at length in previous programs the choices that Iran has, how it can go its own way and develop nuclear weapons, or how it can work with the Russians and the Chinese. I've set out some of the costs. One of the costs of going with the Russians and the Chinese will be to let the IAEA back in. Just saying. Anyway, so far, the French, the Russians in agreement. And then we see that Macron and Putin continue to agree about the Middle East. The two leaders spoke in favour of settling the crisis around Iran's nuclear program and any other differences arising in the Middle East exclusively via political and diplomatic means. So a ceasefire in Gaza, absolutely. Donald Trump claims that he's managed to get the Israelis to agree to one. I'm far from convinced that that is the case, by the way. We shall see. But the Russians and the Iranians agree that there needs to be a ceasefire in Gaza, and they appear here to endorse Iran's demands that Iran be given guarantees against further military attacks upon itself in return for negotiations about its nuclear program. And then the readout, this part of the readout finishes. They agree to maintain contact in order to coordinate their stances if necessary. That is an interesting statement because, again, it shows how Macron is using the Iran issue, the Middle East issue, in order to find a face-saving way of resuming dialogue with Putin. So when he is confronted by Radek Sikorski and Kaya Kallas and Gabrielis Landsbergis and all of the other hardliners in Europe telling him, how dare you talk with the Russians now? He can say, well, I'm not talking here about Ukraine. I'm not talking here about Europe. I'm talking about the entirely separate, completely different issue, which is the situation in the Middle East. the crisis with Iran, which we all want to solve, and where the Russians perhaps could be helpful. I can't imagine that any of that lot, including, by the way, I should have added Friedrich Merz, will be at all pleased to hear that, or will be at all taken in by it. They already dislike and mistrust Macron almost as much as Putin does. But anyway, that's the cover that Macron intends from now on, it seems to me, to hide behind. And then comes the most important part of the Russian readout, because of course they did in the end have to discuss the situation in Ukraine. And this is what the Russian readout says Putin told Macron. When discussing the situation surrounding Ukraine, Vladimir Putin reiterated that the Ukraine conflict was a direct consequence of the policies pursued by the Western countries, which had for years been ignoring Russia's security interests, creating an anti-Russia staging ground in Ukraine, and condoning the violations of rights of Ukraine's Russian-speaking citizens, and at present were pursuing a policy of prolonging hostilities while supplying the Kiev regime with a variety of modern weapons. Speaking about the prospects of a peaceful settlement, the president of Russia has confirmed Russia's stance on possible agreements. They are to be comprehensive and long-term, provide for the elimination of the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis, and be based on new territorial realities. So the Russians, Vladimir Putin, are not giving an inch, not a whiff of a compromise there. If Macron was hoping to get the Russians to move towards agreeing to some kind of ceasefire, Putin basically would have told him to get stuffed. I'm not saying that that was actually what happened, but the fact that essentially is where we are. I suspect, knowing Macron, that he did bring up the topic of a ceasefire, and I suspect that Putin would have used rather more polite language than the language I have just used. But judging from the readout, the meaning would have been exactly the same. The Russians are not interested in a ceasefire. They're not going to freeze the conflict. They are winning the war, as they know. They're going to win the war, as they know. The recent announcements from Washington, of which I suspect that they would already have had some insight. They probably had some sense that this was coming. I suspect Russian intelligence has at least some idea of the size of American stockpiles, just saying. Anyway, the Russians are in no mood to compromise and gave no indication over the course of this discussion that they are prepared to compromise, and they've already rejected the ceasefire idea and have consistently done so, by the way, since long before Trump became president, and that remains their position. So there it is, the first meaningful contact between a European leader and a Russian leader. And the Russian leader. Olaf Scholz's 2 telephone calls with Putin were, in my opinion, pro forma exercises intended to help Scholz in advance of the recent German parliamentary election. By the way, they did no such thing, just saying. This is an attempt, a kind of attempt by Macron to re-establish some kind of a dialogue with Putin, perhaps in time to build on it. And in my opinion, what is driving it is a dawning realization that the Americans are indeed quitting with the scene, that Europe cannot take its place, and that before very long, the leaders of Europe, the European countries, are going to have to address the reality of a Russian victory in Ukraine. So, an interesting event, a very interesting development, not one I suspect that Zelensky is going to be happy with, but there it is. Notice that there doesn't seem to have been any discussion about the latest decision of the Council of Europe to set up some kind of war crimes tribunal with the Ukrainians. I wonder whether Macron brought it up. I presume not. Anyway, that is a legacy of decisions past. It's looking more anachronistic by the day. Starmer is on his way out. Meloni is prevaricating. Macron sees the way the wind is blowing. That leaves only Friedrich Merz leading an important European country, still, I think, thinking seriously about some kind of a long-term conflict with Russia and clinging on to the hope of some kind of victory there in Ukraine. Anyway, let's move on and let's discuss now quickly the situation on the front lines. In my program yesterday, I neglected to mention that Ukraine has launched a number of further drone and missile attacks against Russia. Presumably this is done in part in response to the much heavier and far more powerful drone and missile attacks that Russia is conducting against Ukraine. The only interesting thing about the latest missile strikes by Ukraine is that they did involve missiles. Now, the Russians are saying that these were Storm Shadows, British Storm Shadows or Scalp missiles. It is likely that the British and the French have sent some more Storm Shadows to Ukraine over the last few months. But according to most reports, the stockpile of Storm Shadows and Scalps is now also very heavily depleted. Any further Storm Shadows or Scalps sent to Ukraine would presumably be new production. There is at least a possibility that the cruise missiles used by Ukraine specifically to attack the Donbass, the two People's Republics, were missiles of some sort, perhaps produced by Ukraine itself. I don't know. All I would say is that, yes, a few drones got through, but in its totality, this strike did little damage. In other respects, in all other respects, the Russian advance continues. And I'm not going to provide a detailed breakdown today. Suffice to say that reports speak of the situation around Pokrovsk deteriorating by the hour and of big Russian advances in the Konstantinovka area and in the western Donbass area and in Dnipropetrovsk region towards the Dnieper. And yesterday, Radovka, the Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, had a very, very interesting account about the situation in Kupiansk. They're talking about street fighting taking place now continuously in Kupiansk itself, about the Ukrainian force there having its supply lines cut off, and of Kupiansk itself in effect being stormed, though Radovka also says that the Russian and Ukrainian commands, for their own separate reasons, have each imposed a new news blackout about developments there. I would also here give my own opinion that there is a certain view that is now circulating that the Russian advance in Sumy region was basically a feint, an attempt to get the Ukrainians to divert forces from Donbass to hold back the Russians in Sumy region. I think the second was the effect. A few weeks ago, as the situation around Konstantinovka and Pokrovsk was collapsing, the Ukrainians transferred troops from Sumy region to try to stabilize the situation in those areas. And that allowed the Russians in Sumy region to advance rapidly. So the Ukrainians, over the last week or so, have transferred a lot of those forces back to Sumy region again, leading perhaps to the accelerating collapse that we are now seeing around Pokrovsk. But my own view is that the Sumy operation is not exactly a feint. I believe that the Russians do intend eventually to capture the city of Sumy. It is just that the Russians right across the front line follow their policy of increasing pressure wherever they can. When the Ukrainians weaken in one place, the Russians attack there, forcing the Ukrainians to move to shuttle forces between different parts of the front line, opening gaps which the Russians then exploit. One big gap that is apparently starting to widen is in Kharkiv region around Volchansk. Radovka also reported that the whole of northern Volchansk is indeed under Russian control. It spoke about the Ukrainian forces defending Volchansk being a shadow of the force that they previously were, and that this has opened the way for the Russians to advance into southern Volchansk, south of the Volcha River, and to capture various important industrial facilities in the industrial zone there. Anyway, I'm not going to discuss this in any further detail. Obviously, these developments with the stop in American military supplies are going to accelerate this trend of Russian advances and could bring forward the moment of a Ukrainian collapse, something that Gideon Rachman was warning about in the Financial Times. But as I said, I'm not going to discuss this in further detail in this program. I want to discuss briefly two further topics. First, again, the situation in the Middle East. It seems to me that the situation between Iran and the United States now is in stalemate. There are no talks. There's no clear message from Iran as to what its long-term intentions are. And I have the sense that, for the moment at least, the Trump administration has no plans to deal with Iran either. So for the moment, that crisis is on pause. Trump seems to be doing whatever he can to try to agree to try to get some kind of ceasefire deal done in Gaza. He says the Israelis have agreed. Hamas has said that whilst it is agreeable to a ceasefire, it has not yet agreed to whatever it is that Trump is proposing. We will have to wait and see. I believe that overall the situation in the Middle East has deteriorated. I have been reading some commentaries on independent media, which, in my opinion, come close to claiming that Iran won the 12-day war. I think that goes too far. I think that overstates what Iran actually achieved during the 12-day war. But I do think, as I've discussed already, that overall Iran came out ahead on points. And I believe that once they've sorted out their internal discussions, they start making what I consider to be the correct decisions, which is to work with their Eurasian partners, then I suspect that we're going to see a significant increase in Iranian influence in the Middle East. It will become increasingly clear that Iran is indeed, apart from Israel, militarily speaking, the Middle East's most powerful country. Anyway, I just want to finish, I'm going to finish this program with a brief discussion of the developing crisis, if that's the right word, between Russia and Azerbaijan. I know it's attracting a certain amount of attention, and I'm having people ask me to comment about it. I'm going to say this whole episode, the precipitating event that began this episode was what looks like a decision by Russian police agencies to roll up a significant organized crime group operating in the Urals, specifically in Yekaterinburg. Now, some of the people involved seem to have had an Azerbaijani background, and some of the reports from Russia suggest that though people of various ethnicities were involved in this group, the backbone of this group was made up of people from Azerbaijan. I obviously don't have the full details. Azerbaijan is complaining vigorously about these actions that have been taken by the Russian authorities in Yekaterinburg. And I am going to set out here what my own operating hypothesis about this whole affair is. And it is based on things I have been hearing about the situation within Azerbaijan for a very, very long time. I've been hearing reports about the fact that the government in Azerbaijan is very repressive, and that in order to maintain control of Azerbaijan, it has had to cut deals with all sorts of rather interesting people, if I can speak in that way, who control various networks inside Azerbaijan itself. And I suspect that it's part of one of these networks that is behind this latest deterioration. I suspect that this rolling up by the Russians of what they clearly see as an organized crime group in the Urals has upset and angered some people associated with that group in Azerbaijan itself. Those people in Azerbaijan have considerable pull in Azerbaijani politics, and probably the authorities in Azerbaijan feel the need to retain their support, and that is what ultimately is precipitating this crisis. In other words, it is not in its origins a geopolitical crisis. It is one that has its roots in organized crime and the influence that certain groups have in politics in Azerbaijan. As you will have noticed, I am choosing my words very carefully. I know that the authorities in Azerbaijan often come and speak out rather strongly against their critics and do sometimes exercise certain influence on people outside Azerbaijan as well. Anyway, whatever. That is my own view. I don't think there is much more to it than that. I think that in a kind of a way, what this incident tells us is a certain amount about the realities within Azerbaijan itself and about the nature of the government system there, and perhaps that doesn't speak well for the long-term stability of that country. Anyway, this is where I'm going to finish this program. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Please remember that if you do go to our shop, there are lots of fine things there which are now related to various cities that might be of interest to you. Last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.